IPv6?
So IPv6, it's an interesting topic. It's a very broad topic because if we look at the world, IP has become essentially the universal transport for communication. So, and we're talking about replacing IP or really IPv4 with IPv6. So it's a pretty broad topic. Obviously in an hour, we're not going to cover everything. What I'm hoping to do is at least give you a good overview, so you have an idea how to get started, how to build a lab, how the basics work, and where to look for more information. I'm certainly happy to take questions as I go along. I probably have more material than we'll have time for. I'd rather do that, so you have reference stuff. But we'll see if we can get through all of it. And if there's a lot of questions, I reserve the right to postpone until the end, just so we can try and get through in close to an hour. I try and always keep my presentations on track time-wise. So without further ado, we can jump in. All right, so probably, in my opinion, the most important part of IPv6 is really why do we need it, or why is it interesting to consider it? And I really think this is key, and it's also, in my opinion, not well understood, because if you talk to anybody about IPv6, if you talk to a company or somebody else about deploying it, this is the first question you're going to get, right? Why? Why should I do it? What's wrong with IPv4? It'd be a lot of work. Why should I bother to change? So here's a high-level view of that question. So really, and there's a whole lot of studies and all kinds of more information, but again, to fit within the constraints of an hour, the problem with IPv4 is the address space is oversubscribed. So we're almost 3-to-1 right now in terms of if you look at unique nodes on the internet versus what the addressing system is designed to use, we have an oversubscription of about 3-to-1. And really a lot of stuff still isn't on the internet yet. So if you looked at the total number of nodes globally running IPv4, it's probably a lot higher than that. So that creates a lot of challenges. And really, just like we're talking tonight, probably the easiest challenge to see is communication. So if I have an addressing system and I can't give everybody a unique address, it's pretty easy to see that that's making communication harder than it needs to be. Right? So we want an addressing system where it's easy to communicate, it's easy to deploy, and we're not agonizing over optimizing it, right? If you're spending a half an hour figuring out how big should I make my wireless subnet, that's a clear indication that the addressing system does not scale to our needs. So probably the best example I can think of that is right now, because this is actually a really big challenge in the wireless space. So BYOD is huge and getting bigger all the time. And so now you have a lot of large businesses, a lot of campuses, the library is another good example, where everybody can bring in mobile devices and potentially get on. So that kind of begs the question, well, how big should we make the subnet size? And if you said, how about if we make it, if we look at the classical system, how about if we make it a Class B address? So we have room for 65,000 devices. A lot of people would look at you like it's heresy, like, you can't use that many addresses, right? That's too many addresses to dedicate to one subnet, which is really ridiculous, right? Because if we step out of networking and we look at, for example, let's look at the postal system. So actually, I grew up in Farmington Hills, and if I look at my parents' subdivision, it's a small sub, it's an old sub, and if I look at the streets have 5-digit address numbers. So a 5-digit address number means we can have 100,000 nodes per street. But if I look at the street, most streets have less than 10 homes. Some of them have, maybe 5. So I mean, that's insane. I mean, how can we allocate 100,000 addresses and only use 5? I mean, that's horrible inefficiency. But I mean, if you go to City Hall, I'm gonna laugh at you, because who cares? Because if you have the right addressing system, it doesn't matter. Right? If you look at the postal system, it basically has virtually an unlimited supply of addresses. And if you have the correct addressing system, that's how it should work. So I think it's really hard for people to see that unless you step outside of IT and just look at other areas, and then it's kind of clear. I'm like, yeah, I mean, this is crazy. Like, I've had conversations where we go back and forth for half an hour fighting over the subnet size for a wireless network. And I mean, that's just nuts. So, I mean, that's to me, that's a clear indicator that we've really outlived the lifespan of IPv4. The other problem is, because like I said, we're oversubscribed over 3-to-1, we can no longer have unique addressing. It's basically impossible. We're long past that. I think we passed that in 2008. If you look at you know, the 1-to-1 subscription to oversubscribe. So that means that because we don't have enough addresses, we have to use NAT. So the problem with NAT is NAT makes it harder to communicate. Because now, for example, anybody use Vonage or some kind of a SIP service, right? That embeds addresses, which means I have to have an application layer gateway to make it work, which makes it harder. In fact, there's been a lot of major applications that have basically gone under or quit or given up because it was too hard to deal with NAT or deal with all the complexities of NAT. And if you look at some of the RFCs on things like stun and NAT traversal, it gets unbelievably complex if you try and support all the permutations you can have with NAT. And really, what value does NAT add? I mean, you know, you could say, I mean, it does, there are some good things, you know, you could argue that topology hiding can be convenient and it can do path control, so there are actually some good things, but the main reason we're using it for is address over subscription. And that's not really valuable, right? It's kind of, it's something, it's a necessary evil. And the bottom line is that makes it really hard to communicate. And so this kind of serves as an inhibitor to innovation. And a good example of that is the home healthcare industry. So if we look at home healthcare, this is something that's basically been written off because with IPv4 NAT, it's too hard, right? And I'm sure everybody can relate to this. How many of you have helped a family member get on the internet? And can you imagine taking your non-technical family member and you're going to explain to them how to set up a NAT gateway, how to set up port forwarding, how to configure their firewall, and you're going to support that whenever there's trouble, right? And whenever there's some new application they want to use, you're going to figure out how to get that working through NAT. And by the way, if you haven't noticed, Uverse and some of the other new services are using multiple layers of NAT. So then it really gets hard. So right, so people looked at stuff like home health, they're like, forget it. It's impossible. It's too hard. It's too complex. So we're not going to do better things because of this barrier. So that's really what IPv6 brings. Is it makes things easy because we have a proper addressing system and it facilitates communication. All right. So next thing I want to talk about is where we're at. So we could spend more time on the why, but that's probably enough for now. So usually the next question is, people are like, all right, you know, maybe it's interesting, but does anybody actually use it? I mean, is it really out there? You know, I don't want to be the first person doing this, so let's look. So there's really two competing factors for IPv6. So one is depletion, right? Our IPv4 addressing system is oversubscribed, and if you watch the news at all, we're close to running out of addresses. You know, are we actually going to run out of addresses? I doubt it. It'll stretch out forever. But in practical terms, in the next 2 or 3 years, maybe a lot sooner, you know, maybe large-scale NAT will stretch out a little more. But in the next couple of years, in all practical terms, basically IPv4 will be exhausted. So that kind of creates some challenges because are we going to start putting everything behind 2 layers of NAT? Because, I mean, that sounds good at first, and so for web content it works. But if I look at things like SIP, voice, video, gaming, none of those things deal well with multiple layers of NAT. So I could redesign all of my home gateway systems and maybe we could come up with some new version of NAT, but it's like, why don't we just deploy IPv6 instead? So that there's kind of a tug of war going on there, but that's one issue. At the other extreme, you have some people that are already convinced that IPv6 is the way to go and they're rolling it out. So you kind of have these two forces. You have IPv4 is running out, and eventually we won't be able to get more addresses, so we have to change something. And then you have the people that are actually deploying it, right? And you kind of have these two forces coming together. So if we look at depletion, the main authority that hands out addresses is Zana, right? So this is well known. They ran out in 2011. They handed out the last addresses to the 5 regional registries. Then if we look at AppNIC, which serves Asia Pacific, they ran out, actually I was going to say last year, but in 2011. And then RIPE, which serves Europe, they ran out in September. So we already have over half the world that's essentially out of addresses. If we look at Aaron, this has actually slid quite a bit. So Aaron, if you've never gotten into kind of internet networking, Aaron is if you need your own independent addresses, in other words, not from an ISP, Aaron is who you go to in North America. And this actually keeps sliding back. Originally it was going to be this year, now it's looking like mid-June. And it just depends. Part of why this is sliding is because AT&T and Verizon and other carriers are now deploying multiple layers of NAT, which we'll talk about later, to kind of try and preserve the lifespan of IPv4. So, but more than likely, in 2014, we're going to hit exhaustion, which essentially means we're out of addresses. So that's one thing. I don't want to spend a lot of time on depletion because I basically, for a while, I've done this for a number of years. For a while, I thought that depletion was going to drive IPv6, but this year, my opinion has changed. Now, I don't think depletion is going to drive IPv6. I think what's going to drive IPv6 is actually deployment. So that's why I don't want to focus on this a lot. However, I do get a lot of questions. So I get a lot of questions saying, well, there's address registries, so I can buy addresses, therefore I don't have to do anything. That's true, but it's an expensive option because you have to buy blocks of 65,000, and they typically go for about $10 an address. So that is an option. It's not a cheap one. Also, I hear, and this mainly comes from the people that run the address registry companies, saying like, oh, we have addresses for 10 years. That's nonsense. We don't need this IPv6 stuff. Don't worry about it. So I like to stick to the facts. If you look at every registry has to reserve 16.7 million addresses. Once they get down to that point, that's called depletion mode. Once they get to that point, you can no longer get provider independent addressing. What does that mean? So this actually happened to one of our customers recently. We have a customer, they're a multinational. They're opening a data center in Europe. They don't want to go to their ISP and get an address. They want to have their own block that's independent of the ISP. Well, they went to RIPE, and RIPE said, sorry, we're in depletion mode. We don't hand out PI space anymore. You have to go to your ISP. That's it. So they have no option. So they're trying to port something from Aaron. So this is actually happening right now, right? So when we enter depletion mode, or we get down to that last 16.7 million addresses, companies can no longer get direct space. They have to go to the ISP. And I don't want to get into a whole networking conversation, but there are some drawbacks and limitations if you have to go with that approach. So this is having a real impact. So if we ignore those reserve blocks, right? Because one more thing I want to point out about that. If I'm an ISP, when I get allocations, I don't get like a Class C. I don't get 200 addresses. I get 1 million addresses. So when regional registries enter this depletion mode where they have this last block of addresses, each ISP can only get 1,000 addresses for the rest of time, IPv4, and that's it, right? So that might sound, if you're thinking in terms of a business, wow, 1,000 public addresses, that's a lot. If you're thinking in terms of AT&T or Verizon or any tier 1 carrier, that's nothing. It's worthless. So basically, once the registries are depleted, we're essentially out. That's the end. So 2 of them are there, and the other 3, we have a total of 113 million addresses left. So this is out of 4 billion, we're down to 113 million. Last year, put it up here, we went through 114 million, although now that RIPE and APNIC are depleted, if we take them out of the equation, this year we'll probably go through 76 million. Right, so actually Aaron could even be depleted in early 2014. But I just like to put these up because if you look at the people that say, we have 5 or 10 years, I mean, that's kind of hilarious. If you look at the statistics, I mean, there's no way. There's no chance that's going to happen. But that's coming because they want to sell you. They're hoping you're going to buy blocks of addresses. So depletion is not that far off, but it's still a ways. Okay, next thing is, if we get away from depletion, let's talk about adoption and growth. So in terms of nodes on the internet, I think right now we're at roughly 12 billion, and we're growing steadily. Up to 2020, we'll be at 50 billion nodes. So this is the other thing too. We're going to have 50 billion nodes in an addressing system designed for 4 billion. Right? Can you see how that would be painful? Anything is possible, but again, it comes down to, is it really in terms of support operations, complexity, troubleshooting, things like that. Is that really what we want? Probably not. So as this keeps growing geometrically, we essentially have three things that are pushing us to IPv6. So one is the world population. We have a little over 7 billion people right now. A little over a third of them are online. Now, one interesting thing that came up before the talk is, if we look at mobile devices, right? How many people have a smartphone or a tablet? Most people, right? This year, mobile devices will surpass PCs as the predominant web access device. Mobile devices are the future. I mean, PCs, laptops, they're not going away, but they will no longer be the majority form. Now, the interesting thing about smartphones is, it turns out, in a lot of less wealthy areas in the world, it's relatively easy to set up cellular service and provide internet access. So you have all these people from Asia and Africa and Latin America that now can go and get a smartphone for relatively cheap and get on the internet. So the number of people connecting is exploding, right? So if we even add a little more, right, that's like a double in 5 years, and it's actually probably going to be sooner than that. That alone is really going to make it difficult for IPv4 to support the internet. So that's number one. That's the smallest one. The next factor is mobile devices themselves. So another interesting thing is, I think in December, the number of mobile devices on the internet surpassed the world's population. So there's now over 7 billion mobile devices connected to the internet. By 2016, that'll be over 10 billion. Now this isn't all devices, this is just mobile devices, right? So you can see, I mean, 10 billion devices in a 4 billion addressing system, right? It's tough to support. That's number two, but the biggest thing is what's called the Internet of Things. So the Internet of Things, this is actually getting a lot of press in the past couple of years. And essentially what it means is this: every year, over 10 billion microprocessors are shipped. And an increasing percentage of those guys are networked. So almost everything electronic is becoming networked. So if I have 10 billion new devices coming online every year, and a sizable percentage of those are networked, you kind of see how that's hard to support in IPv4. So and each one of these things is independently pushing forward. So you have all these things surging, and this is really why IPv4 is crumbling. All right, and then in terms of, another common thing I hear a lot is, yeah, but if we look at like Europe and North America, they're mature markets, there's no growth, you know, why do we need more addresses? This is why. So the Yankee Group actually published a great book called Anywhere, and it talks about, you know, what's causing all this growth. And these are just some common examples, but they predict that by 2015, the average person will have 10 network devices. And these are just examples. All these things, these are all things you can buy now. These aren't theoretical, far off, you know, maybe sometime in the future. These are things that you can order now, right? So as people are getting all these things, and Google the Internet of Things, this is just the tip of the iceberg. As people are getting all these things, more and more things coming online, that's where that growth is coming from in the mobile space. Also, the US federal government has actually done a great service for the world by pushing forward with deployment, because vendors aren't going to actually support IPv6 unless people are buying it. And the biggest driver right now is actually the US federal government. So they are 39% deployed with the internet. And another thing I'd like to point out for people that are still skeptical, if you look at the VA and the DoD, which are the two largest internet users in the world, they are going IPv6 only. In other words, no more IPv4 in 2015. Right, so I work with some of the defense contractors who are quaking in their boots because, you know, they're like, oh, we haven't deployed IPv6 yet. Oh, well, how are you going to work with your main contractor? You kind of see the color drain out of their face, right? So I mean, this is not some theoretical thing. This is here now. All right, in terms of things that we can see on a more day-to-day basis in terms of what's going on. So Comcast is actually probably the trailblazer for IPv6. They've been doing stuff for a long time. There's actually been stuff in the press recently about their architect and some other people getting awards for making so much progress with the IPv6 front. But as of December, 2.5% of their traffic is native IPv6, and they will be done with their entire deployment in June of this year. In fact, I